what is the plot of Dandadan? The best answer is something about romance or Okarune's Falls, but the truth is that there is no plot. There's no big villain and there's no plot to destroy the world. Manga fans will say this comes later, but even now we still don't know what the plot is. So you would think that a story with zero plot would be hated, but that's the thing. Dandadan is literally about Okarune's balls, and it's been the #1 anime in the world for almost a year. So the question everyone eventually asks is, why do people like Dandadan so much when even the fans don't really know what it's about? Of course, everyone will tell you about the blossoming romance between Okarune and Momo, but the real answer is something that you see people say all the time. Dandadan doesn't have a plot because it's a character-driven story. With plot-driven stories, we invest in the events. We want to see how they get resolved. With character-driven stories, we invest in the characters. We want to see how they grow. And that's what most people invest in Dandadan for. They watch it to see what happens with Okarune and Momo, but they also watch it because they're invested in the growing cast of characters like Gigi and the upcoming character Kinta. In this sense, Dandadan is kind of like Fairy Tail. There was a plot, but also not really. But that's not why people like the story. Ask people who like Fairy Tail why they like Fairy Tail. Almost every single person will tell you they don't care so much about the story because the characters are the story. And that's the appeal of Dandadan as well, or any character-driven story. We don't need some big plot because the characters make the story. That being said, this does raise a weird question. Namely, how do you write a story with no plot? I mean, Dandadan is a character-driven story, right? So how do you progress the story if nothing happens? Now, obviously, stuff happens in Dandadan. Getting attacked by aliens and monsters isn't nothing. But something you would see people say in the early days of the manga is, what's the point? For the most part, all they're really doing is looking for Okarune's balls. So for the first half of the story, when they can never actually find Okarune's balls, what people really want to know isn't what's the plot, but rather where is the story headed? And it's this latter question that's all the more important in distinguishing character-driven and plot-driven stories, because character-driven stories require a slightly different approach. Now, to be clear, this isn't a binary thing. It's not like a story is either character-driven or plot-driven. In fact, most stories are both. The meaningful conversation is actually figuring out where the story leans closer. So for example, something like Star Wars is right in the middle, because there is a very clear plot that drives the story, but those original trilogies are also driven by the story of the Skywalkers and their struggle to decide where they belong in the world. So that's like 50-50. Going back to anime, something like One Piece is clearly more plot-driven. There's a lot of good character writing, but sometimes it feels like the world drives more of the story than the actual characters. There's just so much going on that the main characters feel like one small part of that, but that's what a plot-driven story looks like, and that's what we're used to. The question we want to answer is, how do you write a story if you're not going to do that? And I'd actually like to start with what not to do. What you shouldn't do is have the characters go through the same arcs over and over again, which is exactly what happens in Rent-A-Girlfriend. Rent-A-Girlfriend is a classic example of a soap opera. The story does have a plot, but the plot is really just drama between all of the characters. So it's mostly character driven. And Rent-A-Girlfriend is very good at keeping you hooked. It mainly does this by perpetually teasing at the main couple making progress, but never actually delivering. The downside to this is that it makes the story incredibly insulting to readers. I mean, it's like 400 chapters long now, and they've only just made progress in their romance. That'd be like if Luffy took 400 chapters to... Okay, well, that's probably not a good example. Yeah, you get the point. The problem is that the characters are the whole story, but the characters repeat the same cycles over and over and barely ever change or show any signs of their experience. To the point where you often ask yourself, where is the story going? Which is what I said before about early Dandadan. But these are two different situations. People say, where's this going about Rent-A-Girlfriend because it takes forever just to make the smallest progress in a relationship. People say this about Dandadan because it's clearly setting up some kind of plot, but it takes time doing it. Everyone knows that it's focused on Okarun and Momo, so nobody looks at them and says, okay, where is this going? And that's because Dandadan is a masterpiece in character-driven stories. It opens by establishing the dynamic between Okarun and Momo. Okarun wants to fight for some friends, and Momo is looking for her own Ken Takakura. From this point on, each new chapter and each new arc contributes to progressing that dynamic in a meaningful way. So in the next chapter, it's technically about fighting that big sumo monster, but what we really take away is that Okarun and Momo establish the boundaries in their relationship. They tease each other, cross some lines, and learn where their boundaries are. In the next arc, we actually get a more plot-driven story, but at the end of it, we watch Okarun and Momo start to experience this awkwardness because they feel like they want to be more than just friends. Even in the next arc, when we meet Ira and Acrobatic Silky, it comes down to Momo getting jealous about Okarun, and Okarun wanting to be strong for Momo. And even in the big Evil Eye arc with all kinds of villains, it all comes down to Okarun having his first romantic rival, and the couple being closer than ever as their friendship evolves into a more romantic relationship. This is how Dandadan progresses a story without actually having a story. Instead of making it about saving the world or uncovering some evil scheme, it's about the characters. The characters are what we care about, so the characters and their growing dynamics drive the progress. But that does leave open another question, namely about villains. So just a moment ago, I said that the Evil Eye arc has all kinds of villains, but that's not technically true. To explain what I mean, let me ask you this. Who is the villain of the Evil Eye arc? You would think, well, it's gotta be Evil Eye, right?
My fucking name is in it.
But is he really? A villain is like the big bad, the person who sets the events of the story in motion. Frieza killed the Saiyans, Crocodile conspired to rule Alabasta, but did Evil Eye really set anything in motion? The Evil Eye arc is weird because Evil Eye is the closest thing we have to our first villain, but he's really just one of several antagonists. If anything, the Kito family are the villains because they set up Gigi's family and they sacrificed to the worm, but they didn't summon Evil Eye. They didn't make him fight Okarun. On the other hand, Evil Eye is clearly the main antagonistic force. He represents the focus of Okarun's desire to protect Momo. Yet, he didn't kill all those people, and he didn't summon the worm. So you could argue that there's many villains in this arc, but that kinda defeats the purpose of having a villain. It's less of a story and more like one big Mexican standoff. But Dandadan gets away with it because it leans more towards character-driven storytelling. In fact, this is the other reason Dandadan is such a good character-driven story, because it strikes this very weird balance of letting the story revolve around the characters rather than the plot, but having enough plot development that it also feels like a plot-driven story. The first example of this is the fight against Turbo Granny. Turbo Granny is the closest thing we have to a villain in early Dandadan, probably more so than Evil Eye. Because at least with Turbo Granny, she actually set this up. She challenged Okarun and Momo. She had this big plan to team up with the Crab Spirit. That being said, this probably would never have happened if Okarun didn't go bothering her in the first place. It's not like she was planning on attacking the main characters. Again, this arc strikes a brilliant balance between feeling plot-driven, but really not having a big plot. A lot goes on, but Turbo Granny isn't a true villain, and it's mostly about Okarun and Momo working together. And this is why Dandadan really doesn't have any villains, because there really is no plot being set in motion. The main struggles that we see start and end with Okarun and Momo. There are antagonists, but they usually have very limited roles in the story. There is one guy that finally seems like he's the big bad of the series, but that's something that came much later. Dandadan became insanely popular for 2 seasons with no villains, no real plot, and that is because it does have some plot stuff going on, but it goes all in on the romance. It goes all in on meaningful character growth and character arcs that progress in meaningful ways. This extends to the side characters as much as it does Okarun and Momo. In fact, this is another reason why people love Dandadan but they hate Rent-A-Girlfriend. In Rent-A-Girlfriend, even if the main couple sucks, you could at least have a story where everyone likes the side characters. But the only way to do that is to offer side characters with likable qualities and the capacity to actually grow throughout the story. The only character to do this is Sumi. She starts out shy but is incredibly incredibly selfless and wants to be more bold. It's these qualities that earned her a spin-off manga. Besides Sumi, none of the characters grow and they make the same mistakes and never learn their lesson. This never happens in Dandadan. Actually, what happens is that all of the characters get to be the heroes of their own story. Kinta eventually becomes the king of nerds we all wish we could be and becomes a regular member of the main crew. Gigi struggles to manage his powers as he learns self-control. Ira becomes the team leader. Even Turbo Granny becomes like the auntie of the group as she mentors everyone, especially Okarun and Momo. There might not be a crazy big plot until later in the story, but nobody really cares because we really just want to see more of these characters. And that is why Dandadan has an amazing story with zero plot.